The temperature in Harlan County, Kentucky on the morning of January the 8th, 1952, sat at 8 degrees below zero, and the kind of cold that lived in those mountains was not the kind you argued with. It did not negotiate. It did not care about the length of a marriage or the age of a woman or the number of years she had spent turning rocky ground into something that fed people. It simply existed, absolute and indifferent, pressing down on the hollow like a hand over a mouth. Margaret Calloway. Maggie, to everyone who had ever known her well enough to call her anything, stood at the door of the farmhouse she had lived in for 35 years and did not look down at her feet. She was 62 years old. Her hair had gone the color of creek ice in winter, pulled back the way it always was, tight and practical. Her hands resting at her sides were the hands of a woman who had spent 3 decades doing work that most men in Harlan County would have considered beyond them, cracked along the knuckles, thickened at the joints, permanently stained at the fingertip lines with the particular dark of good soil. She held a canvas bag against her hip with one arm. In the other hand, loose at her side, she held nothing. She had made a point of that. A woman leaving on her own terms carries only what she chose to carry. Roy Calloway stood in the doorway with his arms crossed over his chest, the way a man stands when he has made a decision he knows is wrong, but has decided to commit to anyway. He was Harold's older brother by 4 years, which meant he was 66 and should have known better. And the fact that he did know better was visible in the particular set of his jaw, too tight, the way a jaw gets when a man is working to keep something down that wants to come up. Behind him, Beverly Calloway hovered at the edge of the kitchen light like something that had not yet decided whether to step forward or retreat. She was wearing her good house dress. She had put it on for this. That detail told Maggie everything she needed to know about how long this morning had been planned. The boots that should have been on Maggie's feet were sitting on the mat inside the door. Roy had placed them there the previous evening with a single sentence that was dressed up like a legal argument. Those were Harold's boots, purchased with Harold's money, and they would stay in Harold's house. Maggie had gone to bed that night in her wool socks and spent the hours until dawn considering what she knew about frostbite, at what temperature it set in, how long the process took, which tissues went first. She was not being morbid. She was being practical. If she was going to walk out of this hollow in January without proper boots, she needed to know what she was working with. She had found in the cedar chest at the foot of the bed that had been her bed for 35 years, a pair of heavy wool socks she had knitted herself during the winter of 1943, while Harold was somewhere in the Pacific and she was managing 12 acres alone. She put them on. 2 pairs. She wrapped her feet additionally in strips of burlap she cut from a feed sack in the barn before dawn, before Roy was awake, moving through the dark of a place she knew so thoroughly she could have navigated it blind, which she nearly had to. The burlap would not keep out the cold indefinitely, but indefinitely was not what she needed. She needed enough. The people who knew Maggie Calloway, and there were not many who knew her well because well was a standard she held to a high bar, would have told you that the most remarkable thing about her was not her intelligence, though that was considerable, and not her stubbornness, though that was legendary in its own quiet way. The most remarkable thing about Maggie Calloway was that she had never once in 62 years confused knowing something with being required to say it out loud. She carried an enormous amount of knowledge in absolute silence. She knew the pH level of every cultivated acre on the property. She knew which section of North Pasture had been slowly poisoned by runoff from an old ore pit 2 ridges over, and she knew it because she had watched the clover thin out over 6 years and drawn the conclusion herself before any county agent had come anywhere near the idea. She knew the names of grasses that most farmers in eastern Kentucky couldn't have identified at gunpoint. She knew that the soil in the lower field had been overplanted with the same crop rotation for so long that it had essentially given up, and she had a plan for restoring it that she had written out in her farming notebooks in careful pencil, a plan she would now never execute on this particular piece of ground. All of that knowledge was the thing Roy Calloway had been living next to for 11 years, since Harold's heart first started giving trouble and Roy began spending more time at the farm, and it was the thing he could not forgive. Not the knowledge itself, perhaps, but what it implied. That a woman he had dismissed as a schoolteacher's daughter from up near Evarts, a woman Harold had married in a small ceremony in 1917, that Roy had attended with the visible reluctance of a man attending something he considered a mistake, had spent the intervening decades becoming the single most competent farmer in a 20-mile radius. That every time something went wrong on Roy's adjacent property, the answer had been standing in Maggie's kitchen already. The trouble between them had a specific history, as trouble always does if you're willing to trace it back past the most recent wound to the older ones underneath. In the spring of 1944, when Harold was still in the Pacific, and Roy was managing his own 50 acres with the particular overconfidence of a man who had never lost a significant crop, Maggie had tried to tell him about intercropping. She had been reading a USDA bulletin about nitrogen fixation, about the old Three Sisters method that the Cherokee had practiced on this same ground centuries before anyone named Callaway or anybody else had put a deed to it. She told Roy that planting a legume alongside his corn would replenish what the corn took from the soil, and that the practice was documented and repeatable and would cost him nothing but a small adjustment to his spacing. Roy had laughed. Not the good kind of laugh, the kind that contains actual pleasure. The other kind, the kind that is shaped like laughter, but is made of something harder. He told 3 men at the hardware store in Harlan what his sister-in-law had suggested, and they had all laughed the same way. By August of that year, Roy's corn yield was the worst he'd recorded in 15 years. Maggie's field, intercropped with Kentucky wonder beans along every fourth row, came in at a volume that caused the man at the grain co-op to look up from his clipboard and ask her twice if she'd measured right. Roy said the weather had been different on her side of the hill. He said it for 4 years with declining conviction and eventually stopped saying it without ever saying anything else instead. In the summer of 1948, Roy's best dairy cow, a 4-year-old Guernsey he'd paid real money for, stopped eating and stood in the far corner of the pasture for 3 days with her head hanging in a way that experienced farmers recognized as the particular posture of an animal that has decided somewhere below conscious thought that continuing to exist might not be worth the effort. Roy had called a veterinarian from Harlan who charged him $12 to come out and say the animal's blood count was off and he wasn't certain why. Maggie had walked over uninvited and stood at the fence for 10 minutes watching the cow. Then she had walked back to her kitchen and come back with a copy of a livestock mineral guide she had borrowed from the extension office and a piece of paper on which she had written out what she thought the problem was. The soil in these pastures has been farmed the same way for 30 years, she told him. The grasses have nothing left in them. The cow isn't sick. She's deficient trace mineral selenium, most likely maybe cobalt. Get a commercial mineral block, the kind with selenium and cobalt, listed on the label, not just salt. Mix 2 cups of crushed limestone into her feed for a week. Give it 10 days. Roy had looked at the piece of paper and looked at Maggie and looked back at the paper. He did not thank her. But he did what she'd written down because the $12 veterinarian had not given him anything better to do. The cow was back to normal in 9 days. He thanked the veterinarian when he ran into him in Evarts 2 weeks later. He told the man that whatever he'd done had worked. The veterinarian, to his credit, told Roy he hadn't done a thing and seemed curious about what had changed. Roy changed the subject. Maggie knew about this secondhand from Earl Dawson at the general store, who had been present for the conversation. She filed it away without comment. She had been filing things away without comment her entire adult life, and the cabinet was getting full. The final incident, the one that functioned in Roy Callaway's internal accounting as permission for what he was about to do, happened in December 1951, 3 weeks before Harold's funeral, and in the strange, suspended time of a marriage that was ending without either person fully accepting it was ending. Harold had been declining for 2 years. His heart was not something the doctors in Lexington could fix, and Harold had known it longer than he'd admitted to Maggie, which was its own kind of wound she was still determining the depth of. In December, with Harold essentially bedridden, Roy had come over to check on his brother and ended up in the barn with 2 neighbors from down the road, Garth Perkins and his younger brother Lewis, looking at Roy's remaining dairy cow who had stopped giving milk 3 days earlier. Maggie had come out to the barn to get a tool she needed and found 3 men standing around the cow discussing slaughter prices. She stood in the barn door with her hand still on the latch and looked at the animal, and the animal's condition was something she could read the way some people read faces. The coat was dull in a specific way. The posture was specific. She could see the pasture through the barn window, and she could see the frost-killed grass, and she could see exactly what had happened over the course of that grazing season, which was that Roy had been so occupied with Harold's illness and his own complications that the pasture mineral maintenance she had suggested to him 4 years ago had simply stopped. Your soil is depleted again, she told them. Same problem as before. The grass has nothing in it, so the milk has nothing in it, so there's no point to the milk from the cow's perspective. Salt block and limestone in her feed, same as before. You'll have milk in 10 days. She had said it flatly without preamble because the situation was flat. It was a straightforward diagnosis of a straightforward problem, and she had not looked at Roy's face while she said it, which was her mistake. Not because looking at his face would have changed the truth of what she said, but because it might have warned her what was coming. Roy did not speak for a moment. Garth Perkins looked at the floor. Lewis Perkins looked at the cow. Then Roy said in a voice that was very quiet and very controlled that he didn't recall asking for her opinion. She had gone back inside without answering. Harold had been awake, propped against the headboard with the particular alertness of a man whose body was failing, but whose mind was still burning clear, and he had heard enough of it through the thin walls of the farmhouse. He reached out and took her hand when she came in, and he held it for a moment without speaking, and the thing he didn't say out loud was something they both understood perfectly, that he had never protected her from Roy the way he should have, and that he knew it, and that there was not enough time left to fix it. Harold Calloway died on a Tuesday morning in November of 1951 in the bedroom where he had slept for 40 years with Maggie, holding one hand and a winter light coming through the east window. He was 65 years old, and he had been on balance a good man, not a remarkable man, not a man who had ever set the world on fire, but a man who had gone to war when called and come home and worked his ground and treated the people around him mostly with the decency they were owed. His greatest failure, as Maggie understood it, was that he had loved her without ever quite believing she was as capable as she was, which is the kind of love that over decades becomes a form of subtraction. He had also failed to update his will. The document that governed the disposition of Harold Calloway's property had been written in 1931, the year Roy had pressed him to get his affairs in order after an uncle on the Calloway side died intestate and created a family chaos that lasted 3 years. In 1931, Harold and Maggie had been married for 14 years, and Harold had intended to write her into the will properly, but had put it off in the way that people put off things that require confronting the idea of their own death. And then he had put it off again, and then he had gone to war, and then he had come home, and there had always been something more immediate, more pressing, more present than the paperwork at the bottom of the drawer. The lawyer in Harlan, a man named Fletcher, had a kind face and the manner of someone delivering news he'd delivered before, which made it no easier to receive. Under Kentucky law, as it stood in 1952 and under the terms of the 1931 will, Harold's real property, the house and the 12 acres, reverted to Roy Calloway as the named next of kin, given the absence of a valid post-marriage document. Fletcher told Maggie that she might have legal recourse, that the law had provisions that contesting it was possible, but the way he said possible made clear that he meant possible in the same way that surviving a winter alone in the mountains was possible, technically accurate, practically remote for a woman of her age and resources. Roy had known about the will situation for months. Maggie realized this later, not bitterly, but with the particular clearness of vision that comes when something you suspected turns out to be simply true. The conversation in the barn in December, the 3 weeks that followed Harold's death, the careful patience with which Roy had handled the immediate aftermath of the funeral, all of it had the quality of a man waiting for a process to complete. He had not invented the legal circumstance. He had simply chosen not to fix it, and Maggie understood the difference, and the difference mattered less than she might have expected it to. Beverly Calloway had been the active force. This was also something Maggie understood with the clarity of 35 years of proximity. Beverly was not a cruel woman. Cruelty requires a certain energy, a commitment to causing harm that Beverly had never possessed. She was something more ordinary and in its way more difficult to argue with a frightened woman who had organized her entire understanding of herself around comparison and who had spent 11 years living 40 yards from a neighbor whose competence quietly dismantled every version of herself she had managed to construct. Beverly's 2 daughters had married and moved to Lexington and Louisville. Beverly's garden was adequate. Beverly's cooking was fine. Beverly's husband came over to his sister-in-law's farm whenever something needed figuring out, and Beverly had noticed every single time, and the accumulation of those noticings had built over 11 years into something that needed to resolve itself somehow. She had pressed Roy. Not dramatically. Beverly did not do things dramatically. She had pressed him the way water presses on a dam, consistently in every small conversation, in every quiet moment when they were alone. She had asked what they were going to do about the property. She had mentioned several times that it wasn't right for a widow to be occupying 12 acres she had no legal claim to when there was family who could make better use of it. She had been careful never to be the villain in any version of the story she told herself, and in that she had largely succeeded because villains require self-awareness about the harm they're causing, and Beverly had kept herself very comfortable in the territory just below that awareness. Roy had given Maggie 48 hours. The notice was delivered on a Sunday morning, and it was delivered quietly, almost gently in the kitchen, without Beverly present, which told Maggie that Roy was not entirely comfortable with what he was doing, and which made her respect him marginally more than she might have otherwise, because at least the discomfort was real. He told her that she could take her personal belongings, that the furniture was part of the property, but that he would not press the point on smaller items, and that he hoped she understood it was a matter of legal necessity and not personal feeling. Maggie had looked at him for a long moment. The thing she could have said was considerable. The legal argument alone, the 35 years of labor he had put into ground, that would now be valued at twice what Harold had paid for it, at least partly because of what she'd done to it, would have filled the kitchen. Instead, she said simply and without inflection, "I'll be gone by Tuesday." She spent those 48 hours doing something Roy had not anticipated and Beverly would not have understood. She went out to the land, not to mourn it, or not primarily. She went to document it. She went to every section of the 12 acres with her farming notebook and her pencil, and she recorded what she knew. The East Lower Field needed lime before spring planting, and she wrote down the rate per acre. The north fence line had a section where the post had rotted at the base and would fail within the year, and she marked it with the distance from the gate. The old apple trees in the southeast corner, which she had grafted and pruned for 15 years, were finally producing at their peak, and she wrote down the specific varieties and their pollination requirements. The small kitchen garden had a nematode problem in the soil around the tomato beds that she had been managing with a marigold intercrop for 3 seasons, and she wrote down the method. She filled 12 pages of her notebook. Then she went inside, made a pot of coffee, sat at the kitchen table, tore the pages out of the notebook cleanly along the margin, and left them in the center of the table weighted down with the salt shaker. No note, no explanation. Just the information, because the information was for the land, and the land would still be there, and it deserved someone who knew what it needed, even if that someone would never have figured it out on his own. She packed her canvas bag in 10 minutes. She was not a woman who struggled with the question of what mattered. Into the bag went the 2 books she had decided were the 2 books, a copy of the USD, a farmer's bulletin on home dairying and goat management, a staple-bound document she had technically borrowed from the county extension office some months ago and had not returned, and a worn library copy of a Kentucky geological survey that covered the limestone cave systems of the eastern mountain counties, a book that had come on the bookmobile, and which she had simply failed to give back with a vague internal promise to pay the replacement fee someday. Into the bag went the wool scarf Clara had knitted for her birthday 2 years ago, the last gift from her daughter before the silence between them had settled in. Into the bag went a framed photograph of Harold in 1940, standing in the east field with his hand on the fence post, squinting into the summer sun, looking slightly annoyed at being photographed, looking, in other words, exactly like himself. Into the bag went her working gloves, a folding knife Harold had carried during the war, and her smaller notebook, the one with 30 pages left. She also took the burlap strips she had already wrapped around her feet. She did not take the boots by the door. She stepped off the porch at 7 in the morning on Tuesday, January 8th, and she walked north. The road out of the hollow was a frozen track between the mountains, and she had walked it so many times over so many years that she knew its character the way, you know, the character of a difficult but familiar person, where it turned unexpectedly, where it rose faster than it appeared to, where the creek crossing got treacherous in hard winter. She walked steadily, not fast, with the careful economy of motion of someone who understood that 62-year-old joints in 8 below temperatures had a finite reserve, and that reserve needed to be budgeted against whatever the morning required. She did not look back. She had a destination in mind, which was the difference between her leaving and a younger person's leaving. She was not walking away from something. She was walking toward a specific geography that she carried in her head in the geological survey and in her own memory of one afternoon 20 years ago when she and Harold had gone into the northern end of the valley to look for morel mushrooms, and she had noticed through a gap in the tree line the remnants of a homestead on a south-facing slope. The sight had stayed with her the way certain sights do not, because they are beautiful, but because they are right, because something in them corresponds to a shape you didn't know you were looking for. She had asked Harold whose land it was. He'd said the Hooper family who had left for Detroit during the First World War to work in the manufacturing plants and never come back. She had filed it away with everything else she filed away in the enormous, quiet library of things she had observed and retained without yet knowing what she would use them for. She crossed the main creek on a rock ford she remembered, and the ice at the edges cracked under her weight without giving way. She angled northeast up the slope, through a stand of bare hardwoods, following the high ground, the way someone who knows mountain terrain follows high ground, because the hollows collect cold air, the way cups collect water, and the ridgelines, though more exposed to wind, offer slightly higher temperatures at the skin level where it matters. She stopped twice. Once to rewrap the burlap around her left foot where it had loosened and she could feel the first fingers of numbness reaching toward her toes, and once at the top of a ridge to orient herself against the landscape. From that height, she could see three distinct hollows and the gray smoke signatures of two inhabited farmsteads in the bare treeless line of an old mining access road 2 miles east. She was where she thought she was. She adjusted her angle and went down the other side. The walk took 5 hours. In the last hour, the light had already begun to thin in the way January light thins not gradually but in sudden increments, as though the day is making a series of decisions about how quickly to abandon you, and the temperature had dropped another 4 degrees, and her feet had moved through the stage of burning and the stage of acute discomfort and into a condition she recognized from her reading as the beginning of serious cold injury, not pain, but a kind of blankness in the extremities, an absence of report. She kept moving. Movement was not optional. She came through a narrow gap between two ridges, and the hollow opened in front of her, south-facing and sheltered, and the light fell differently into it from the angle of the slope in a way that made it slightly measurably warmer than the ground she'd just crossed. She felt the change on her face before she saw anything else. The cabin had been gone a long time. What remained was a chimney standing in the snow, like something that had refused to participate in the collapse around it, and a scattering of foundation stones barely visible under 2 feet of drifted white, and the ghost of a fence line in the remnant posts that had not yet fully rotted. But behind the ruin built into the slope of the hill itself in the way that serious farmers used to build things when they built them to last rather than to impress, was a series of structures that the snow had not entirely buried. Stone-walled chambers, set into the hillside at intervals with heavy timber, doors still in their frames facing east, to catch the morning light and angled slightly into the slope to use the earth as insulation. 4 of them that she could count from where she stood connected by a covered passage that was partly collapsed, but partly intact. The timber was old beyond easy dating, but it was eastern red cedar, rot-resistant, dense-grained, and enough of it had survived that the basic structure held. The doors had iron hinges that had rusted to a reddish brown, but had not yet failed. She stood in the snow and looked at it. The feeling she had was not relief. Relief implies that the alternative was catastrophic, and Maggie Calloway had already passed that moment some hours back when she was in the gap between ridges and her feet had stopped reporting. What she felt was something more complicated and harder to name. It was something in the neighborhood of recognition. As though this arrangement of stones and timber and south-facing slope was something her mind had been describing to itself in the background for years without ever quite finishing the sentence, and now the sentence had an ending. She had never been here. She was certain of that, and yet the certainty was uncomfortable in a way she set aside for later, because the light was going and the cold was absolute, and certainty about inexplicable things could wait until she wasn't dying. The door to the first chamber opened with effort. The hinges had set with rust, and the frame had settled, but it opened. The second chamber was cleaner, drier. The third had a partial roof collapse that she catalogued and dismissed. The fourth was intact and deep running further into the hillside than the others, and when she pulled its door shut behind her, the change in temperature was immediate and real. Not warm, but no longer actively killing her. The Earth's own warmth. She had read about it, the phenomenon by which the ground a few feet below the frost line maintains a steady temperature regardless of what the surface weather is doing because the ground stores heat from the entire accumulated summer and releases it slowly through the winter like a body cooling after fever. Root cellars worked on this principle. Caves worked on this principle. And these chambers cut deep enough into the hillside that the back walls were earthen rather than stone worked on this principle, and she could feel it 5 degrees, maybe 8 degrees warmer than outside, which in 8 below weather was not comfort but was survival. She built a fire in the time remaining, light allowed. She found in the debris of the collapsed passage between chambers a length of dry cedar that had been sheltered enough by the roof above it to remain combustible. She had Harold's knife in the Geological Survey book, which she used the back pages of, as kindling, tearing them out with a methodical lack of sentimentality. She had read them enough times to have retained what mattered, and warmth was more immediately practical than a map she had memorized. The first fire smoked badly. The flue passage in the old chimney connection was partially blocked by debris, and she spent 20 minutes in near darkness, clearing it with a stick, working by feel, coughing in the close air until the draft caught and the smoke began to climb in the right direction. She melted snow in the cast iron pot she found in the second chamber, already blackened with decades of previous use and cracked at the base but serviceable if you didn't let it boil hard. She drank. She rewrapped her feet with the burlap, which was damp now and less useful, and layered the wool scarf over them. Clara's scarf meant for a neck, and she sat with her back against the warm earth wall and let the fire work. The photograph of Harold she propped against the base of the wall where the firelight reached it because the darkness of that first night was considerable, and she had no interest in adding to it. He looked in the firelight slightly more alive than he was, which was the trick that fire plays on photographs, and she was willing to accept the trick. She thought in the methodical way she had always thought when the emotion of a situation could not be addressed directly about the practical inventory of her position. She had a fire. She had water. She had 2 books, 1 knife, 2 pairs of wool socks, burlap wrappings, a canvas bag with room in it, still 12 pages of a notebook, and a pencil stub. She had 35 years of agricultural knowledge in her head and a geological survey's worth of information about the limestone karst system under these particular mountains. She had somewhere in the cellular memory of her body the accumulated problem-solving of 6 decades of a life that had never been especially easy and had made her correspondingly difficult to stop. What she did not have was time for the kind of grief that the last 2 months deserved. That grief was real, and it was waiting, and she was not naive enough to think it wouldn't collect its due eventually. But grief is patient in a way that cold is not, and for now the cold was the more immediate creditor. She slept in the way that exhausted people sleep in cold places. Not continuously, but in intervals interrupted by the necessity of feeding the fire each interval, a small negotiation between the body's need for rest and the body's need to not be dead. Between intervals, she lay on the dirt floor with a canvas bag under her head and listened to the mountain. A mountain at night in January is not quiet. The wood contracts in the cold and makes sounds like distant firearms. Ice shifts in the creek she had followed into the hollow, and the sound carries up the slope like voices in a language just outside comprehension. The wind found small gaps in the timber door and spoke through them with a thin, consistent note that changed pitch as the night went on. Maggie listened to all of it and did not find it frightening. She found it informative. She was already, even on that first night, even in the extremity of cold and exhaustion and loss that the day had deposited her into cataloging. Wind direction from the northwest, which meant the north chamber face would be most exposed and the east chamber would be most sheltered. The timber door had 2 gaps that could be chinked with clay from the earthen wall. The fire draft was strongest when the wind was from the north, which meant the old chimney connected to a natural fissure in the rock above that functioned as an extension of the flue. She wrote these things down in the small notebook with the pencil stub sitting close enough to the fire to see the page. On the morning of the 3rd day, she went deeper. The 4th chamber had been bothering her in the way that things bother minds that are constituted to pursue incomplete information. Its back wall was different from the other chambers, earthen, rather than stone-packed and firm, but earthen. She had brought the broken-handled shovel she had found in the debris of the passage, iron blade still, solid handle repaired with a length of cedar she had lashed on with strips of burlap, and she spent the first part of the morning working at the wall, systematically starting at the base where the earth was loosest. The blade went through on the 4th stroke, not through earth, Through into space, the change in air pressure was immediate and unmistakable, a drawing outward as though the mountain had exhaled. Cold air coming from inside, which meant the space beyond was connected to the exterior, somewhere above which meant it was not a sealed cavity, which meant she was not about to be buried alive. And she allowed herself to notice that she had been more concerned about that possibility than she had acknowledged to herself. She widened the hole over the next 2 hours until she could fit through it. She made a torch from a length of cedar, and a strip of her burlap soaked in the small amount of animal fat she had rendered from a rabbit she had found frozen under a log 2 days prior. Not much, but enough to make the torch burn for 15 minutes if she was careful with it. She went through. The passage was narrow at first, barely shoulder width, running at a slight downward angle into the limestone for perhaps 30 feet before widening into something she had to let herself feel before she could see a space with height, with the particular acoustic quality of an empty room, rather than a tunnel with air moving through it from some source above and settling to stillness at the center. She held the torch up. The walls were limestone cream and gray, with the crystalline surface texture she recognized from the geological survey illustrations. The space was perhaps 40 feet across at its widest. The ceiling was 8 feet at the center. It was not a cathedral, it was not a wonder of nature, but it was a barn-sized cavity inside a mountain drywalled, naturally temperature-regulated, with structural limestone that had been holding its own weight since before there were people in Kentucky to notice it. And running across the floor in a channel it had worn for itself over centuries, dark and steady and cold and absolutely clean, was water. Maggie Calloway crouched beside it. She cupped her hand and tasted it. Limestone-filtered mineral with the particular character of deep earth water that has not seen the surface in a very long time, which meant it had not seen the surface contamination that had been killing livestock in the hollows downstream of the old mine workings. She felt the temperature of it against her palm. 55 degrees, she estimated, give or take 3 degrees. She had no thermometer, but she had spent enough years working with dairy animals and dairy products to know what 55-degree water felt like, because 55 degrees was the temperature at which fresh milk could be held safely for 24 hours, the temperature at which soft cheese aged correctly, the temperature that the old USDA bulletin described in its plain-spoken government prose as the ideal dairy environment. She sat on the cold stone floor in the torchlight, with the spring running over its ancient channel 2 feet in front of her, and the mountain pressing in from all sides, and the torch burning down toward her fingers, and she laughed. It was a short sound, unmirthful in the way of laughs that are surprised out of you by the sheer improbability of what's in front of you. And it startled her. She had not expected to laugh, had not thought of herself as someone who had laughing left in her, not this week, not this month. But there it was. She went back through the passage to the chamber and added wood to the fire and sat for a while with the geological survey open on her knees. She was reading, but she was also thinking in the deeper register that ran below. Reading the place where problems were assembled into structures, where what she knew was being sorted against, what she had just found, and what she understood about the intersection of the two. Goats. The word arrived with the quality of a conclusion rather than an idea, the end of a chain of reasoning that had been running in the background since she'd first felt the change in air temperature when she'd stepped through the chamber door the first night. Dairy goats. Hardy in rough terrain, economical in feed conversion, manageable by a single person, valued at near nothing by most farmers in these mountains, which meant acquirable at near nothing by someone who had something to trade. The underground chambers, with their stable temperatures, meant animals that wouldn't burn feed calories, fighting cold in winter. The spring meant water that didn't require hauling or treating. The south-facing terrace slope above which she had walked the previous afternoon, and which had the particular aspect and drainage of land that could be cultivated, meant the possibility of supplemental feed grown on site. She was not planning. Planning required certainty of execution. She was doing the things she had done her entire adult life, which was seeing what was actually in front of her, rather than what she had expected to find, and building from what was there. She picked up her notebook. She turned to a fresh page. She wrote the date, January 11th, 1952. Then she stopped because something under her boot had resisted the movement of her foot, something hard and flat and not rock. She moved her boot, Anne brushed at the dirt with her hand and found the blade of a shovel, old iron rust patterned on the surface but solid underneath with a handle that had long since rotted to a broken stub. She pulled it free of the packed earth it had been half buried in and turned it over. The iron was stamped in the manufacturing fashion of the previous century, not a name but three initials pressed into the iron near the socket, EMC. She held it in the firelight for a long moment. Margaret Eleanor Combs. That had been her name before she was a Calloway. Before Harold, before the farm, before 35 years of a life she had been told she no longer had any claim to. Her mother's name had been Eleanor. Her mother had told her once and only once, the kind of telling that doesn't get repeated because it carries more weight than casual repetition can hold, had been a woman named Alma, who had moved up into these mountains before the turn of the century and built something with her hands in a place the world had not yet gotten around to noticing. Maggie set the shovel against the wall with a care she would not have been able to fully explain. She sat back down. She opened her notebook to the fresh page. Outside, the mountain continued its winter business, without comment, indifferent, as always cold and specific and indifferent. She began to write. The first thing Maggie built before the animal quarters, and before the ventilation, and before any of the larger work was a door. Not the chamber door, which already existed and already functioned. A second door set inside the first with a gap of 8 inches between them, an airlock essentially the same principle she had read about in a pamphlet on cold storage management that the county extension office had mailed to every registered farmer in Harlan County 3 years ago, and which most of those farmers had used to start their morning fires. The dead air between the two doors created an insulating buffer that cut the thermal exchange by a measurable amount every time someone passed through, which in a structure whose entire value was temperature stability was not an incidental improvement. It took her 4 days to build it from salvaged timber, and the iron hinges she worked free from the collapsed passage with a flat stone as a hammer. Her hands by the end of the 4th day had bled through 2 sets of glove wrapping, and the cold had gotten into the joints of her fingers in a way that would stay with her in some form for the rest of her life. She finished the door anyway. The Perkins brothers came in February. She had not gone looking for them, and what she had done was walk to Earl Dawson's general store in Everts on a Wednesday morning, the first time she had gone to the store since leaving Roy's property, and she had set 2 pounds of hard cheese on Earl's counter without preamble. The cheese was a rough product. She had been working with small quantities without proper equipment, improvising the pressing and aging process from the USDA bulletin's instructions and from what she could do with the tools available. But it was real cheese, the kind that did not apologize for itself, and Earl Dawson cut a piece and ate it before he said a word. Then he looked at her across the counter with the expression of a man recalculating something. She told him what she needed: 2 or 3 people who were strong, who could keep their mouths mostly shut, and who were owed something by Roy Calloway. Earl told her about Garth and Lewis Perkins, who had worked Roy's property for 2 seasons and been turned off without full pay when Roy's finances contracted after Harold's death, and Roy had decided that the brothers were the most convenient available solution to his accounting problem. They were living that winter in a rented room above the hardware store in Harlan, doing odd jobs, and they were not happy men. Maggie met them on a Thursday at the mouth of the hollow. Garth was 43, broad through the shoulders, a man who communicated primarily in the displacement of air around him. His presence was physical and decided, and when he crossed his arms across his chest, it meant he was listening more carefully than his face let on. Lewis was 38 and built along similar lines, but with a restlessness in him, a quality of a man whose body processed difficulty into motion, which meant he was the faster worker of the two, and also the more dangerous when something went wrong. She showed them the chambers. She showed them the inner cave with the spring. She showed them her plans drawn on the last pages of the geological survey in pencil, the ventilation system, the drainage channels, the proposed layout of the animal quarters, the composting structure she intended to build against the south-facing hillside. Garth looked at the plans for a long time and then looked at the chambers and then looked back at the plans. His verdict arrived after a silence that Maggie had learned to recognize in working men as a sign of genuine consideration rather than reluctance. You've thought this through pretty thoroughly for somebody who's been living in a hole in a hill for 3 weeks. She told them she would pay in product. No cash because she had none, $12 and some change total, which she was preserving for necessities she could not produce or scavenge. But as soon as she had animals producing, They would receive a fixed portion of the dairy output every week for as long as they helped. She was not asking for charity. She was proposing a transaction with a delayed payment structure, which was how most of Appalachian economy had always actually functioned, stripped of any pretense otherwise. Lewis asked how she knew the animals would produce enough to be worth their labor. She looked at him with the steady patience of a woman who had been asked to justify her competence at regular intervals for 6 decades. Because I know what I'm doing, you can choose to believe that or not, but I'd suggest you taste the cheese first and decide after. Lewis tasted the cheese. He showed up the following Monday with his brother and a set of tools. The work proceeded in stages that the season dictated. January and February were for the underground structure, reinforcing the chamber walls with stone hauled from the creek bed, clearing and widening the passage between the chambers, building the internal framework for the animal stalls. The stonework was the hardest labor. The limestone in the creek bed ran to pieces that averaged 40 pounds, and getting them up the slope and into position required the kind of sustained physical effort that Maggie participated in equally, which was something the Perkins brothers noticed without commenting on directly. What they did comment on obliquely was that she knew things about stonework, about how weight transferred, about where mortar was load-bearing, and where it was cosmetic that Garth, who had done this work for 20 years, had not expected her to know. She had learned it from reading a structural manual borrowed from the Harlan County Library in 1946 when she'd been planning to build a milk house on Harold's property and had instead filed the knowledge away when the plan was deferred and the deferral became permanent. The day the passage gave way was in early March. The plan that morning had been to break through the earthen section between the fourth chamber and the cave passage, widening the connection Maggie had originally forced through with a shovel, making it large enough to move equipment through without having to dismantle it. The section of earth they were removing was stable by every measure Garth had applied. He had worked enough underground to know the signs of compromised fill, and he had checked it twice. What none of them had accounted for was the shelf of limestone 8 feet above the opening that had been resting on the compacted earth for 40 years, and which, when enough of that earth was removed from the base, shifted. It did not fall. What it did was worse than falling. It moved 3 inches forward and down, and the earth around it redistributed, and the section of passage wall to the right of where Maggie was standing folded inward. Garth and Lewis were both outside the passage at the moment of the shift. Maggie was inside. The collapse filled the passage entrance behind her. Not completely, there was a gap at the top, the thickness of a man's hand, through which cold air moved. But it was enough that she could not get out the way she had come in, and in front of her, the cave passage was blocked by the fallen limestone shelf and the earth that had come down with it. The torch she'd been carrying had gone out in the disturbance. She was in absolute darkness. She knew her position precisely 7 feet into the passage from the chamber entrance, 2 feet of debris behind her immovable stone in front. Ceiling intact overhead, she had checked it with her hands before she registered anything else, running her palms along the rock above her head with the focused attention of a woman who needed one thing to be true in order to proceed. The ceiling was intact. She was not about to be crushed. She sat down on the passage floor and breathed. Not because she was calm. She was not calm. Her heart was doing something in her chest that was not its usual business, and she was aware of a pressure behind her sternum that was either fear or the very early stage of oxygen concern, and she did not know which and could not afford to treat them differently in any case. She breathed slowly. She counted breaths. She did this because it was the rational thing to do, and because she had learned over 62 years of difficulty that the body responds to discipline even when the mind is not fully in agreement with the plan. Outside, she could hear Garth's voice through the gap at the top, steadied by the deliberate flatness of a man who is also working to stay useful. "Maggie, talk to me." She told him where she was. She told him the ceiling was intact. She told him she needed them to clear the debris from the top down, starting with the lightest material, and not to rush it because a second shift in the wrong direction would make the situation genuinely unrecoverable, and to take it seriously when she said not to rush. Garth's voice, "You just tell us if anything changes in there." She said she would. Then she sat in the dark and waited, and while she waited, she did the thing her mind always defaulted to when the external situation was outside her control. She worked on what she could work on. She put her hand against the passage floor and felt the air movement across her skin, faint directional, coming from the left side at roughly knee height. She tracked it with both hands, feeling along the passage wall. There was a gap in the stone she had not noticed before, a natural fissure running vertically in the limestone, perhaps 4 inches wide and deeper than she could probe with her fingers. The air from the fissure was not the cold air of the outside. It was cave air, neutral, constant, smelling of wet mineral. It connected somewhere in the rock to the larger system below, which meant the cave system she had found was not as isolated as the surveyed passages suggested, which meant there was more down there than what she'd already mapped. She got out her notebook. She could not see what she was writing. She wrote in the dark by feel, keeping the letters as deliberate as she could manage. Fissure left wall, 3 feet above floor, air temp, warmer than passage SE facing based on draft direction. She wrote for 40 minutes. When the debris above the gap was finally cleared enough for her to be pulled through, Garth reached down and took her arm, and Lewis took the other. And when she came out into the chamber light, Garth looked at her face for a long moment, and she looked back at him steadily, and he let out a breath that had a lot of the last 40 minutes in it. Then he looked at the notebook she was holding. "You were writing in there." The thing she told him settled into a silence that lasted through the rest of the morning's work. "I needed to do something useful, so I did something useful. That's the whole of it." Ruth Elkins lived on Pigeon Creek, 4 miles over the ridge to the east, in a house that the local consensus had long ago decided was barely better than a structure, than a reason to be suspicious of its occupant. The path to it was not marked and did not want to be. Maggie had heard Ruth's name for years. It circulated in the particular way that names circulate in mountain communities, when the person attached to the name has chosen to opt out of the social contract, and the community has responded by turning the person into a category rather than an individual. Ruth Elkins, strange kept to herself, grew things people didn't ask about, talked to animals. The version of Ruth that lived in Harlan County's collective memory was a cartoon, flat and simplified, and cartoons are what communities produce when they encounter something they cannot flatten into a useful shape. The first time Maggie went to Pigeon Creek in late February, Ruth's door stayed closed. Not locked, the door moved slightly in its frame when Maggie knocked, meaning it was not bolted, meaning the refusal was deliberate. Maggie stood on the porch for 10 minutes, said what she had to say to the closed door in a clear and normal voice: who she was, what she was doing, that she had no interest in imposing, but had heard Ruth kept goats and she wanted to talk about that if Ruth was willing at some point, and then walked the 4 miles back. The second time was 2 weeks later, early March, a week before the passage collapse. The door opened this time. Ruth Elkins was perhaps 75 thin, in the way of people who have spent a long time deciding what to keep and what to let go, with gray hair cut practically short and eyes that move with a physician's quality of rapid comprehensive assessment. She stood in the doorway and looked at Maggie for a long time without speaking, which Maggie recognized as the same kind of silence she herself used, the silence of someone who considers words a commitment and does not make commitments without thinking them through first. Then Ruth told her she was busy and closed the door. Maggie walked the 4 miles back again without particular frustration. She was not trying to charm Ruth Elkins. She was trying to demonstrate that she was serious, and serious things required patience. The third visit in April came after the passage collapse and after 2 weeks of slower work, while the structure was reevaluated and the new approach was planned. Maggie brought with her a small covered bucket. She had been composting a carefully managed pile in the south corner of the largest chamber, turning it by hand every day, with the repaired shovel monitoring its temperature with her palm. The compost had reached a stage she was satisfied with, dark and fine-textured, and she had scooped a sample into the bucket. She walked to Pigeon Creek and set the bucket on Ruth's porch and knocked, and when the door opened, she did not say good morning or launch into an explanation. She held out the bucket. "I need to know if I'm getting the carbon ratio right. I don't have a test kit, and I can't get one, and you've been working this land long enough that I'd trust your nose over a store-bought kit anyway." Ruth looked at the bucket. She took it. She opened the lid and smelled it, and then, with a matter-of-factness that Maggie recognized as the professional gesture it was, she put 2 fingers into the compost and pinched a sample and rubbed it between her fingers and felt the texture. She handed the bucket back. "Ratio's fine. You're running a little hot means your nitrogen's high. Add more brown material, dry leaves or straw, or pull it back from center. Then, come inside. Ruth's house was small and serious, a place where every object had been kept, because it served a function, and removed because it stopped serving one. The walls had shelves of composition books in neat rows filled in a handwriting that was precise in the way of someone trained to write under difficult conditions, abbreviations, symbols, a system of notation that had developed over decades. Maggie stood at the shelves while Ruth put water on, and she read the labels on the composition book's spine's plant names, mostly followed by dates and locations. Some of the dates went back to 1919. Ruth set 2 cups on the table. The story came out in the way stories come out between 2 private women who have both decided to be direct, not in a continuous narrative, but in specific, significant pieces delivered without embellishment and received without reaction. Ruth had been an army nurse in the First World War, not an unusual thing for a woman of her generation in a patriotic county, except that Ruth had served in a field hospital in France and had come back in 1919 with a nursing certificate, a comprehensive practical knowledge of infection, nutrition, and tissue repair, and a complete inability to live in Harlan County's social rhythms as though nothing had happened. She had tried for 5 years. Then she had moved to Pigeon Creek, planted her garden, and started her composition books, and the county had converted her into a category, and she had let them because categories were mostly left alone. The knowledge Ruth had accumulated in those composition books was not herbal mysticism, which was the story the county told about it. It was applied nutritional science, the relationship between soil mineral content and plant composition and animal health worked out empirically over 30 years of observation on the same piece of ground. When she talked about goats, she talked about them the way a clinical practitioner talks about patients, specific, measurable, interested in the mechanisms rather than the outcomes. A goat will tell you what it needs if you know the language, she told Maggie, turning her cup in both hands. The problem is that most people are so busy telling the animal what to do that they never stop long enough to listen to what it's already saying. She gave Maggie 4 does, not 2 young ones, 4 adult does currently producing, which required no waiting and no guessing. The exchange was a month of fence repair on Ruth's house south pasture line, which Maggie completed across 6 separate trips over the following 3 weeks, working alongside the older woman who directed from a considered distance and occasionally corrected Maggie's post-setting technique with the unsparing directness of someone who had never learned to soften accurate information. The goats arrived at the Hollow in May. Their names were the Perkins brothers' contribution. Lewis had named them without asking permission, and the names were Lila, June, Harriet, and Frances, after his sisters and his mother and an aunt, which Maggie accepted because the animals came when called, and in May an animal comes to is a name worth keeping. She housed them in the first 2 chambers, which she and the Perkins brothers had converted to animal quarters, over the spring straw floors, simple timber milking stands, fresh air circulating through the ventilation system at a rate she had worked out empirically by watching the straw move, and adjusted by opening or blocking the hollow log air channels that ran through the earth and ceiling to the surface above. The first batch of cheese was a failure of a specific and educational kind. She had not controlled the starter culture carefully enough, had allowed cross-contamination between the aging environment and the fresh milk, and the result was a product that smelled accurate but tasted wrong in a way that she identified from the USDA bulletin as the signature of unwanted bacterial activity at the wrong temperature stage. She wrote down exactly what had happened and changed one variable. The second batch was a failure of a different kind. She had overcorrected on the acid development, pulling the curd too early, and the resulting texture was grainy and dry, commercially unsaleable, though she ate it herself because she was not in a position to be particular about texture when the alternative was going without. The third batch was closer. The fourth was right. Ruth tasted the 4th batch on one of Maggie's fence repair visits, tilted her head, and said, "Acid's balanced. You want to let it age another 5 days before you wrap it." She said it the way she said most things, not as praise, but as information, which was for Maggie the highest form of respect available. She had been selling to Earl Dawson since late May. Not large quantities, she was still building herd output, still refining the aging process, still learning the specific character of what the cave environment produced in terms of flavor and texture, but enough to establish a price and a reputation, which are the 2 things a product needs before quantity can mean anything. Earl had introduced her to two households in Evarts who bought direct and a woman who ran a boarding house in Harlan who ordered a wheel every 2 weeks and paid without complaint. By July, Maggie was earning enough to buy what she could not make or scavenge, and the enterprise had graduated from survival project to something that could if she let it become an actual operation. It was Earl who told her about Gerald Fitch, a man from Lexington. Earl said one morning in late July when she came to the store with a delivery, well-dressed, which in Harlan in 1952 meant aggressively out of place, carrying maps and a briefcase. Had been in the store twice asking about land ownership in the Northern Valley, being very friendly about it in the way that people are very friendly when they already know what they want and are trying to determine the price. Earl told Maggie because Earl was a practical man and Maggie was his best supplier, and practical men protect their supply chains. Gerald Fitch arrived at the Hollow 11 days later. He came on a Tuesday morning, which was probably not accidental. Tuesday mornings were when the Perkins brothers did not come, which would have been easy enough to determine by asking around, and Fitch was the kind of man who determined things before he acted on them. He had two men with him who wore their size the way men sometimes do when they are employed to wear it. He had a folder of documents. He had the manner of someone who had done this particular thing several times and found it generally resolved itself in the direction he intended. The tunnel dairy was not what he had expected to find. Maggie saw his face process it as he came through the outer door, the professionalism of the chambers, the evident productivity, the systematic quality of what he was looking at, and she saw the recalculation happening in real time. He had come expecting a squatter. What he found was an operation. He laid out the situation in legal language that was designed to sound like inevitability. The land she was occupying was under consideration for purchase by a development interest. Her presence was technically a trespass on property that had reverted to the county. After the Hooper family's departure decades prior, the county had authorized a review of the land's disposition, and there were interested parties with legitimate claims. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten explicitly. He described a future as though it were weather already determined, already on its way, unfortunate but not personal. Maggie had been making butter when they arrived. Her hands were still coated with the pale residue of it, and she did not wipe them off, and she stood in the entrance to the first chamber with the low light from inside making a shape behind her, and she said, "The land this structure is built on was deeded to Alma Combs in 1887. I know this because I found the original claim documentation in the Harlan County Registrar's records 3 weeks ago when I walked to town specifically to look for it. Alma Combs was my grandmother, which I can document through my mother's birth certificate on file with the county. That chain of title has never been properly transferred or vacated, which makes this an active inheritance question, not a trespass question. You have your folder and I have mine. We can discuss it in front of a judge, or we can discuss it here, but the outcome of the first conversation determines whether we bother with the second one." Fitch looked at her for a moment. He was a man who processed information efficiently. She could see it working. He closed the folder. He told her this was not the end of the conversation. She told him she had not suggested it was. They left. She went back to the butter. The legal situation was real and the threat was real, and she was not naive about either. The chain of title she had described to Fitch was genuine. Ruth had told her about Alma Combs and the original settlement when Maggie had asked about the land's history on her second fence repair visit, and the trip to the county registrar had confirmed what Ruth knew. But confirmation of an old deed was not the same as a clear modern title, and Fitch had resources and connections and a development interest behind him that had more leverage on the county machinery than a 62-year-old widow with butter on her hands. She had a legal basis. She did not yet have a legal victory. What she had, in addition to the deed question, was the thing she had found in the geological survey and confirmed with Daniel Marsh's preliminary visit in December. But that was later, and what she had in September was the principle she had identified herself. The spring in the cave ran year-round and was a natural water source of sufficient volume that it might qualify under the Kentucky water law provisions and that govern public water resources provisions that had been written to prevent exactly the kind of industrial acquisition Fitch was proposing for a valley that sat above a significant underground water system. She wrote a letter to the County Water Authority and another to the State Geological Survey Office. She wrote them carefully in the tone of a person requesting information rather than making an accusation, because she had learned that the tone of a request determines whether it receives an answer. Clara Calloway arrived on a Thursday in September, 2 days after Fitch's visit, which was a convergence that Maggie had no way to have anticipated and which rearranged everything that was already complicated about the month. Clara was 41. She had her father's coloring, dark hair, Harold's particular way of standing with his weight shifted to the left hip, and her mother's eyes, which was a fact that Maggie had always registered with the complex feeling of things that are simultaneously a source of love and pain. She had been living in Cincinnati for 8 years with a man named Dennis Sykes, whom Maggie had met twice and disliked with the specific informed dislike of a woman who recognizes in someone else the particular combination of charm and control that constitutes the architecture of a certain kind of damage. Clara had not come to Harold's funeral. She had sent a card with a brief note that was clearly composed under constraint, the sentences too careful, the apology for absence too oblique and too brief. Maggie had read it 3 times and put it in the cedar box, where she kept things she was not yet ready to fully think about. Clara was thinner than Maggie remembered, and dressed more carefully than the situation called for, which was another form of information. She had taken the bus from Cincinnati to Harlan and hired someone to drive her out to Everts and walk the rest of the way with a suitcase that was too heavy for the terrain. She arrived at the Hollow with the expression of a woman who has been rehearsing a conversation for a long time and is now facing the reality that the other person is not going to perform their assigned part. She had expected to find her mother diminished. That was apparent in the first 30 seconds, the way Clara's eyes moved over the chambers and the terrace work and the stacked rounds of aging cheese with a confusion that came from an anticipated picture failing to match the actual one. She had expected a woman in a hard situation who needed rescuing. What she found was a woman in a hard situation who had built something from it. The conversation they needed to have did not happen immediately. What happened first was that Clara ate she had not eaten since the bus, which was 10 hours, and the food Maggie gave her was the food the Hollow produced, which was simple and specific and tasted like the work behind it. Clara ate 2 helpings of everything and did not say much, and Maggie watched her daughter the way she watched the goats, not waiting for particular words, but reading the posture, the pace, the quality of the silence between bites. Fitch had contacted Clara in August. This emerged over the following hour not as a confession, but as a piece of information Clara had decided she needed to be honest about, which meant she had been sitting with the dishonesty of not saying it long enough that the wait had become worse than the saying. Fitch had found her through Roy's lawyer, Roy, who knew Clara's address in Cincinnati because Harold had kept it in the farm records, and Roy, who had been in contact with Fitch's people since June. The offer was real money, more than Clara had ever held in her life, in exchange for her signature as Harold's surviving immediate family member on a document that would clear the title question on the Northern Valley land. She was not being asked to do anything illegal. She was being asked to make legal what was currently complicated. The money was what she needed. That was the part Clara could not say directly, but which Maggie understood within the first 20 minutes. The money was the only thing Clara could see between herself and staying in the apartment in Cincinnati with a man who had over 8 years systematically removed every other option. Not dramatically, Dennis Sykes was not a man who made dramatic scenes. He was a man who made subtle ones, who had quietly ended friendships and slowly redirected income and gradually restructured the logistics of Clara's daily life until the architecture of her dependency was complete and invisible. It was exactly the kind of damage Maggie had seen in the man's face the 2 times they had met. When Maggie understood this, she sat with it for a moment without speaking because she needed a moment with it. Then she said, "I'm not going to sign. I want to be clear about that first, because I won't let you leave here thinking there's a version of this conversation that ends with me signing." Clara's face went through something complicated. Then Maggie continued, "But you're not going back to Cincinnati before we talk about that apartment and what you need to do about it, which is a different conversation from the land, and one that I should have started 2 years ago when I still had a house to have it in. Stay a month, 1 month. After that, you can do whatever you decide." Clara did not agree immediately. She slept on it or failed to sleep on it, which amounted to the same decision, and in the morning she was still there. She came out to help with the morning milking without being asked and without explaining why, which Maggie recognized as the language of someone doing the only thing they know how to do when everything else is unresolved. She had been raised on a farm. Her hands remembered what her mind was still negotiating. Lila stood still for her on the first try. June took a minute. Harriet was difficult, as Harriet always was, and Clara's quiet, patient persistence with the animal had a quality in it that Maggie watched from the doorway with the particular attention of a mother watching a child be someone the mother did not fully know. The month turned into 2 months and then stopped counting. Clara began handling the distribution records in October, the accounts of what went to Earl, what went to the boarding house, what was owed by which household and when. She had a head for numbers that Harold had also possessed, a clean, spatial relationship with figures that Maggie, who was more word and system than pure arithmetic, found genuinely useful. The business, and it was a business, now undeniably ran more cleanly once Clara's attention was on the logistics of it. They did not talk about this directly. They simply divided the work the way water divides around a stone by the path that was available. The pressure from Fitch continued through November in the form of a letter from a Lexington law firm that raised the trespass question again in more formal language. Maggie showed the letter to Earl, who showed it to his wife's brother, who was a retired circuit court clerk, and who looked at it carefully and said the claim was thin and would be thinner if the water authority question was still active. Which it was. Maggie had received an acknowledgement of her inquiry from the State Geological Office in October that indicated a field survey was being scheduled. Fitch apparently had not anticipated that a woman making cheese in a mountain cave would have written letters to state offices, and the state's interest in the water system complicated his picture considerably. By December, the Perkins brothers had helped construct the fourth of the planned building phases, a greenhouse structure built against the south-facing hillside using salvaged window glass from 2 abandoned farmhouses in the valley, in a timber frame that Garth had built with the precision of a man who took structural work personally. The floor heat came from a composting chamber underneath it, manure and straw from the goat quarters, managed at a temperature that generated enough warmth to keep the air above it where the plants were from freezing in Kentucky winters. Kale spinach, 2 varieties of lettuce herbs. Not abundant sufficiency. The difference mattered, and Maggie held it as a distinction worth maintaining. Daniel Marsh came on a Wednesday in December, in the last week before Christmas. He was younger than she had expected from the late 20s, with the careful, slightly anxious quality of someone who has been educated extensively in a subject and is now for the first time confronting the subject in a form that was not anticipated by his education. He had come from the University of Kentucky's Agricultural Extension Program, following up on the letter Maggie had sent to the County Water Authority, which had been forwarded to the Extension Office because the office was apparently the county's default repository for agricultural information it didn't know what to do with. He had not come to help, which was the first thing he made clear, possibly because he expected her to want him to. He had come because what she had described in her letter was technically interesting to him, and he wanted to see if it was real. It was real, and watching him understand that it was real was a process Maggie found privately instructive. He moved through the chambers with the particular focus of a man whose analytical framework is being revised in real time, noting details with a small notebook, asking questions that were good questions, the kind that came from someone who understood the underlying principles well enough to ask about the variations from them. He spent 40 minutes in the inner cave with the spring measuring the water temperature with a proper thermometer he produced from his coat pocket, taking notes on the ventilation system, examining the drainage channels cut into the cave floor. When he came back through to the outer chambers, his notebook had a lot in it. Then he stood in the entrance to the first chamber, looking at the whole of what he had seen, and he told her he had read about systems designed on similar principles in engineering documentation from the Army Corps of Engineers used during the Second World War for food preservation in extreme climates. He asked if she had drawn from those sources. She looked at him for the length of time it took to decide that the question deserved a direct answer rather than a polite one. No, I drew from a USDA home dairying bulletin, a Kentucky Geological Survey, and 35 years of farming in this county. The Army Corps of Engineers arrived at the same conclusions I did because the underlying physics are not complicated. They're just not commonly applied by people who have other options. He wrote something in his notebook. He told her he would like to come back in the spring with instruments and document the system properly. She told him he was welcome to, provided the documentation said clearly where the system came from and who had developed it. He agreed, which would turn out to mean less than she intended and would require a different conversation later. Before he left, he stopped at the door of the inner chamber where the cheese wheels were aging in their rows, pale and precise and fragrant in the particular way of good cave-age product, and he looked at them for a moment with an expression that contained something more than professional interest. Clara was standing at the cheese shelves rewrapping a wheel that had developed an uneven rind, and she looked up at him, and he looked at her, and they both looked back at what they were doing, which was a kind of conversation Maggie observed from the doorway and chose to stay outside of. She went back to the goats. Outside, the December wind was doing its seasonal work on the Kentucky mountains, and the temperature at the surface had dropped to something that made the 8-degree morning she had walked out into 11 months ago feel by comparison almost merciful. Underground in the chambers, the temperature held at what it always held at. What the Earth had taken 11 months to understand, she was not giving back. January of 1953 arrived in eastern Kentucky with the particular cruelty of a winter that has already done significant damage and has decided to continue anyway. The temperature in the first week dropped below zero on 4 consecutive nights, and the snow that came on the 8th of the month was not the decorative kind, but the kind that meant business-heavy, wind-driven, filling the hollows to a depth that made the roads between communities go from difficult to impassable to simply absent. The mountains in that condition did not distinguish between people who deserved the difficulty and people who did not. They simply closed. The hollow functioned. That was the word Maggie returned to when she assessed the state of things in those first weeks of the new year. Not thrived, not prospered, but functioned, which was the appropriate word for a system that had been built to operate precisely in the conditions that were currently being applied to it. The 14 goats in the first 3 chambers were producing at a rate that had stabilized over the fall months into something she could budget against. The greenhouse was giving kale and spinach and 3 kinds of herbs, heated from below by the compost system and from the south-facing glass above, and the output went into cheese, into butter, into the direct nutrition of the 4 people who now lived and worked in the hollow, which was Maggie and Clara and the Perkins brothers, who had by this point moved from their rented room in Harlan to a cabin they built themselves on the ridge above the hollow, using timber from a stand of dead chestnuts killed by the blight 2 decades prior that they had been clearing as part of the terrace expansion. Clara had not left. She had also not formally decided to stay, which was a distinction she maintained internally, and which Maggie respected without pressing, because she understood that a decision made under duress is not the same as a decision made freely, and Clara was still in the process of determining which kind she was capable of. Dennis Sykes had written 3 times. The first letter was conciliatory in tone, which was the tone he had used historically when something needed to be recovered. The second was more functional, a request for information about property she had left in Cincinnati, phrased in the way that requests for property are phrased when they are also arguments about who has the right to leave. The third letter did not arrive until February, and by that time the events of January had changed the particular gravity of everything in the hollow, and Clara read it at the kitchen table and put it in the stove without finishing it. Maggie saw her do it and said nothing, and the nothing she said was one of the more useful things she had provided her daughter in 41 years. The diphtheria outbreak did not announce itself. Disease rarely does in isolated communities. What happens is that a child is sick, and then a child in another family is sick, and for a week or 10 days each family manages its own situation privately, partly from the mountain instinct toward self-sufficiency, and partly because admitting that a child is seriously ill requires also admitting that you may not be able to handle it, and that admission has a cost. It was the 3rd week of January before the pattern became visible enough that the doctor in Harlan, a man named Aldridge, who covered a practice area that in decent weather could be managed by 1 person, and in January, snow was a geography more suited to 4 understood what he was dealing with. 18 children across a dozen families in the surrounding hollows. The youngest was 14 months. The oldest was 11. Diphtheria is a disease with specific nutritional requirements for recovery. Not in the folk sense, not in the general sense of feed a cold and starve a fever, but in the precise clinical sense that the toxin produced by the bacteria depletes specific proteins, and the immune response requires specific caloric support, and the children who had the best outcomes were the ones whose bodies had something to fight with before the disease arrived. Aldridge had the antitoxin, which he had driven through the snow to Lexington to get, and driven back with, which was not a small thing. What he could not produce from his medical bag was fresh milk and vegetables in January, in a county where the cows were dry and the roads to Lexington had been impassable for 11 days. Earl Dawson knew who to call. Earl always knew. It was the quality that made him essential in his community, not charm, not capital, but a comprehensive and continually updated map of who had what and who needed what and where the distance between those 2 points could be bridged. He drove his truck as far as the snow would allow, which was to the base of the ridge below the hollow, and then he walked. 3 miles through snow that in places came to his waist. He was 61 years old and not a small man, and the walk took him 2 hours, and when he arrived at the hollow entrance, his face was the particular gray-red of a man who has made a serious physical demand on himself and is not certain he was correct to do so. Maggie brought him inside and gave him something hot and waited while he recovered the capacity for consecutive sentences. He told her about the children. He told her about Aldridge's assessment. He told her what was needed. He watched her face while he spoke, and when he reached the part about the families affected and said the name Callaway Roy's son's family, 2 grandchildren, a boy of 7 and a girl of 4, he paused because he was not a man who was careless with information that had weight in it. Maggie was quiet for long enough that Clara, who was at the cheese shelves across the cave, looked over. Then how many children? Total 18, Earl told her. She stood up and went to the storage area without further questions, and he heard her begin pulling and stacking and assessing the particular cadenced sound of someone taking inventory against a need. She did not deliberate about the Callaway grandchildren. That needs to be said plainly because the easier story would be that she deliberated and chose generosity, and the actual story is that she did not deliberate at all, which is a different and more significant thing. The moment of stillness when Earl said the name Callaway was not deliberation. It was absorption, the way you absorb a piece of information that changes the geometry of a situation without changing what you are going to do about it. She had not spent a year building something that fed people so that she could then decide which people it fed based on what their relatives had done to her in January of the previous year. That was not the farm she had built. It was not the woman she was. What followed was 7 crossings. The first crossing happened the morning after Earl's arrival. He had slept in the outer chamber on a straw pallet that was normally Garth Perkins' bed, and in the morning the 5 of them, Maggie, Clara, Earl, Garth, Lewis, distributed the first load across 5 carrying frames that Maggie and Garth had assembled the night before from timber and canvas strapping. 4 large milk cans, 12 pounds of fresh cheese, 2 bushels of greens from the greenhouse packed in cloth to retain moisture and warmth. They crossed the ridge in a line spaced close enough to keep visual contact using the route Earl had broken on his way in, which had already half closed overnight. The snow was knee-deep on the flat sections and waist-deep in the wind-scoured gaps between ridges. Maggie walked second in the line behind Lewis, who was breaking trail, and she walked steadily and without complaint for 6 hours, in conditions that were in objective terms unsurvivable without preparation and inadequate footwear. She was wearing boots now, real ones purchased with the first 3 months of dairy earnings, and she thought of that fact exactly once at the top of the first ridge, with the wind coming across the summit in a horizontal sheet. And then she thought about the weight distribution of the milk cans and whether the carrying frame's shoulder straps were distributing correctly, because that was the more useful thought to be having. Aldridge met them at the road with a look on his face that shifted from professional assessment to something less composed when he saw what they had brought. He told Maggie what each family needed, who had the sickest children, who was furthest into the recovery curve, and could manage with less where the nursing mothers were, who needed the fat content of the butter specifically. He spoke quickly and with the compressed specificity of a man rationing his own attention across too many patients, and Maggie listened to every word and retained it without writing it down, because her hands were busy and her mind was more reliable than her notebook in any case. Ruth Elkins was already at the first family's house when they arrived. This required a moment's explanation. Ruth had heard about the outbreak from a woman who passed her property on Pigeon Creek and had walked down 3 days earlier before Earl had come to the hollow and had stationed herself at the center of the affected community with her composition books and her 30 years of nutritional observation and her WWI nursing certificate, which she had produced from a cedar box. She apparently kept it in and showed to Aldridge with the flat composure of a woman who had earned the right to be taken seriously and was prepared to document it. Aldridge had taken one look at what she knew and made room. Ruth directed the distribution with the precision of someone who had thought carefully about what each child needed specifically rather than what sick children needed generally. The 14-month-old needed the milk most diluted and warmed to a precise temperature she demonstrated by feel on the inside of her wrist. The 7-year-old Callaway boy, whose fever had broken, but whose throat was still damaged from the toxin, needed the soft cheese in small amounts rather than liquid, because the protein density was what his recovering tissue required, and the texture was gentle enough not to cause additional injury. The 4-year-old girl needed the greens and broth. Ruth directed Maggie through the preparation, specifying ratios and timing, with the calm authority of someone for whom this was not improvisation but practice. They worked through that first day without stopping for anything except what the work required. Maggie moved between houses in the cluster of 3 families that were closest together, carrying heating, serving, washing equipment, and starting again. Clara worked the same circuit with a focus that had nothing uncertain in it. The ambivalence that had characterized her first weeks in the Hollow was gone or set aside or temporarily irrelevant in the face of something immediate and real. She was, Maggie observed, between tasks very good at the physical work of caring for people. She had a quality of presence in a sick room that the children responded to, not sentimental, not soft, but calm and deliberate and specific, in a way that communicated to a frightened child that the person attending them knew what they were doing. The second crossing happened 3 days later. The third 4 days after that. The distances were not short, and the snow was not cooperating, and Maggie was 63 years old and had been working in extreme cold for 2 weeks. And the physical accumulation of it was something she tracked, the way she tracked any system, by the symptoms, by the rate of change, by what the readings meant relative to the threshold. Her joints told her things every morning that she filed under the category of information I am receiving, but not acting on, and she got up and did what needed doing. The Callaway grandchildren turned a corner on the 9th day. Maggie was at another household when it happened and heard about it later from Ruth, who described it with clinical brevity. The boy's fever normalized. The girl began eating without distress. The specific crisis had passed. Ruth delivered this information without ceremony, and Maggie received it without ceremony. And if there was something moving in the simple fact of it, they were both women who had learned to let that kind of thing exist without making a production of it. 3 of the 18 children did not recover. The youngest, the 14-month-old, had been too compromised before the antitoxin arrived, before the milk arrived, before any of it arrived. The disease had been working for too long before anyone understood the pattern. There was also a 6-year-old boy from a family in the furthest Hollow whose case had been complicated by a previous lung condition, and a 9-year-old girl whose death came suddenly on the 15th day after she had appeared to be improving, which was the cruelest kind. Diphtheria is that way sometimes. It does not announce its reconsiderations. Maggie attended all 3 funerals. She did not attend them because she was expected to, because she was not. She attended them because the work she had done had been for all 18 children, and the outcome had not been in her hands, and she believed that when you are present for the effort, you are also present for the cost, and the cost had a human weight that deserved to be stood next to. She stood in the frozen ground of 3 different church cemeteries over the course of 8 days, and she kept her hands clasped in front of her, and she kept her face open rather than composed, because composure at a child's funeral is a thing you do for yourself and not for the people who were grieving, and she was not there for herself. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday at Earl's store, addressed in handwriting she recognized from 35 years of looking at the same handwriting on the same farm's paperwork. Roy's hand, uneven, effortful, the penmanship of a man who had not spent much of his life writing, but understood that some things required paper. She opened it at Earl's counter because she had not expected anything from Roy Callaway, and the unexpectedness of it required immediate processing rather than private consideration. Inside, 2 documents. The first was a quitclaim deed properly signed and notarized, conveying any remaining interest Roy held in the 12-acre Callaway property to Margaret Eleanor Callaway. Not to her as Harold's widow, the language was specific, but to her by name, which was the distinction that mattered legally and in every other sense. The second was smaller. A photograph 3 inches by 4, black bordered on one edge, where it had been trimmed from a larger print. Harold and Maggie in 1917, standing in a field, not the east field she knew, somewhere else, somewhere before the farm, with Harold's hand at her elbow, and her face turned slightly toward the camera with an expression that she did not entirely recognize as herself, but that she understood. Looking at it now was the expression of someone who had no idea yet what the next 35 years would require of them, and was in that ignorance simply and completely present. Roy had kept the photograph. He had kept it since the morning he had placed her boots inside the door and watched her walk away in burlap wrapped feet, in 8 below cold, and he had kept it through 11 months of whatever those 11 months had been for him internally, and now he had sent it without a single word of explanation or apology, which was the most honest thing Roy Calloway had ever communicated to her. She stood at Earl's counter for a moment. Then she folded both documents back into the envelope and put the envelope in her coat pocket, and she said to Earl, "Tell Mrs. Hatcher her cheese order will be ready Thursday." And she went out to the truck Earl had lent her for the week's deliveries and sat behind the wheel for approximately 90 seconds before she started it. The photograph she hung in the inner cave in the aging room on the wall between the third and fourth rows of cheese wheels, where the temperature never varied and the air was always still. It was the same wall where the first fire's smoke had blackened the stone in the early weeks. The blackening had faded slightly as the wall was cleaned over time, but the remnant of it was still visible, and she hung the photograph against that remnant, and it stayed there. Daniel Marsh came back in March with his instruments and his notebooks and a junior colleague from the University Extension Office, a younger woman named Patricia, who took measurements with a competence and efficiency that Maggie appreciated. They spent 3 days doing what Daniel had described, documenting the temperatures, the airflow rates, the milk production numbers relative to the animal housing conditions, the structural specifications of the ventilation system, the geological characteristics of the spring. Maggie answered every question fully and did not withhold information because the work deserved documentation, and the documentation would outlast everyone present. The report was published through the University Extension Office in late April. Daniel brought her a copy. She read it at the kitchen table in the farmhouse above the hollow, the small house Clara had helped her build the previous autumn on the flat ground above the original chamber entrance. 2 rooms and a sleeping loft, simple and solid, nothing Harold's brother could claim any interest in. She read through the technical sections with the attention she brought to anything technical and found them accurate and well-constructed. She read through the attribution section, which was the section that described the origins of the documented system. Her name appeared once in the 3rd paragraph of the background section, local farmer Margaret Calloway. The system was attributed in the language of academic documentation to a study of naturally occurring conditions that had been in Daniel's phrasing, further developed and refined through practical application. His name appeared 11 times. Patricia's appeared 4 times. The USDA framing positioned the work as a research finding rather than a documentation of something someone had invented, which was the framing that made the work publishable in extension channels, but which also systematically removed the fact that a 63-year-old woman with 2 books and a broken shovel had conceived of and constructed the entire system from observation and retained knowledge before anyone with a university credential had come within 20 miles of the hollow. Maggie set the report down on the table with the care she used for things she was deciding how to respond to rather than reacting to, which was the same care she used for everything. Daniel was sitting across from her. He had the expression of a man who had known this conversation was coming and had been unable to find a way to arrive at it on his own terms first. She looked at him for the length of time it took to be certain she was going to say what she meant rather than something smaller. I cooperated with this work because I believed the documentation would be useful, and I believe that still. I also believe that when you put your name on a piece of work 11 times, and the person who built the thing you're describing appears once as a local farmer, you have made a choice, and choices like that have a way of compounding over time into a history that forgets who actually did the work. I'm not asking you to rewrite the report. I'm asking you to understand what you did so that you don't do it again to the next person who lets you in the door. Daniel did not defend himself. To his credit, and Maggie registered it as credit, he simply looked at the report and then looked at her and said, "You're right, I should have come to you about the attribution before it was printed." He held the silence that followed. "Then I'd like to correct it in the next publication. I'm writing a follow-up piece for the State Agricultural Journal. I want to attribute the development of the system correctly." She told him she would cooperate with the follow-up on that understanding. He held to it, and the journal article the following year described the system as the work of Margaret Callaway of Harlan County, with the geological and agricultural knowledge base that had produced it laid out in specific and credited detail. Maggie read that version with a different quality of attention, still critical, still looking for accuracy, but with something underneath the critical attention that was not satisfaction exactly, but was in the neighborhood of things finally being called by their right names. Roy Callaway came in April alone on a Thursday morning when the hollow was damp with the first real warmth of the year and the terraces above were showing the green beginning of what the winter wheat she had seeded in October was doing with the particular energy of seeds that have been waiting. He walked down from the ridge path on his own, no Beverly, no lawyer, no buffer of any kind. He was 67 and the winter had been in him the way hard winters get into men of that age more permanently than they used to. He stood at the entrance to the outer chamber for a moment and looked at what had been built in 11 months, which was the kind of looking that required time because the scope of it was not immediately comprehensible. Then he came inside. Clara saw him first and went very still for a moment, the way the body goes still when it is deciding something before the mind has finished deliberating. Then she picked up the milk she had been carrying and took it to the inner passage and left the two of them in the outer chamber. Roy did not speak immediately. He looked at the milking stands and the stall arrangement and the ventilation system's surface registers, the hollow log openings in the ceiling that brought surface air down and moved stale air up, which were visible from inside as a pattern of regular apertures in the earthen ceiling that a person who understood what they were looking at would recognize as engineered. He looked at the composting chamber's access panel and the drainage channels in the floor and the rows of aging cheese in their wrap on the shelves that lined the inner wall. He looked for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice had in it the quality of something that had been carried a long way and set down. "I was wrong about you." He did not qualify it. He did not add anything to it immediately, which was the right choice because a qualification to that sentence would have been a way of taking back part of what he'd given. Maggie let it land. Then, "You were wrong about a lot of things, Roy, but so was everyone else in that hollow, and so was I about some things, and being wrong isn't the sin. The sin is deciding to stay wrong when the truth has been standing in front of you long enough that you can't honestly claim you haven't seen it." He looked at the floor of the chamber, which was swept stone clean and practical. He asked her how she had known what to do, not about any specific thing, but generally structurally. How had she known that this was possible? She thought about this question honestly before answering it because it deserved honesty rather than a satisfying summary. "I read everything I could get my hands on for 40 years, and I paid attention to what I was actually seeing rather than what I expected to see, and I didn't let anyone else's certainty about what was possible substitute for my own observation of what was in front of me. That's the entire method." He came back the following week, and the week after that. He did not explain why he kept coming, and Maggie did not ask because she understood why. He was a man who had been wrong for a long time and had run out of ways to say so that felt proportionate to the scale of it, and so he had chosen to say it with his presence and his willingness to learn something he should have learned from her 30 years ago. She taught him how to make cheese. She was not gentle about his mistakes in the early attempts. She corrected him the same way she corrected everyone, with precision and without apology, and he received the corrections with the humility of a man who understood he was not in a position to take offense. By June, he was making a serviceable soft cheese from the milk of a single doe he had purchased and installed in a small converted root cellar on his own property. He never became skilled at it, but he showed up every week until the autumn, and that was its own kind of answer to a question neither of them had asked out loud. Beverly Callaway never came to the hollow. This was not discussed. Maggie did not need Beverly to come, and Beverly did not need to go, and the acre of silence between those two facts was sufficient. The years that followed arranged themselves with the logic of things that have been properly built, not without difficulty, not without revision, but with the fundamental structural integrity that comes from a foundation nobody has cut corners on. By 1955, the operation had expanded to include 12 chambers, 41 goats, and a name that came from Clara's suggestion rather than Maggie's Callaway Hollow Dairy, which used the family name that Roy had once withheld from her in a legal document, and which Maggie now put on cheese wrappers sold in 3 counties, which was a kind of quiet answer to that particular chapter. Clara filed for divorce from Dennis Sykes in the spring of 1954 through a lawyer in Harlan who had been referred to her by the same retired circuit court clerk who had helped Maggie with the title question. The process took 14 months and was not without its complications, because Dennis Sykes was a man who responded to the removal of his advantages by making the removal as difficult as possible, which was consistent with everything Maggie had observed about him in 2 meetings. Clara handled it with the same focused practicality she brought to the dairy's distribution accounts, identifying what needed to be done, doing it, moving to the next thing. She did not require Maggie's help with the emotional content of it, which Maggie respected completely, and she did not pretend it was easy, which Maggie also respected. When the final papers came through in the summer of 1955, Clara read them at the kitchen table and then went out to the terrace and sat in the evening light for a while without saying anything to anyone, and Maggie left her alone there and let the evening do whatever work it was going to do. Ruth Elkins died in the spring of 1955 in April when the Pigeon Creek Hollow was doing its annual astonishment with redbuds and the kind of air that makes you briefly credulous about renewal. She died in her sleep, which was consistent with the way she had lived without drama, without making a fuss on her own terms, in her own house, with the composition books in their rows on the shelves, and the garden already showing the first green of that year's planting. Maggie found out from a neighbor who passed the Hollow Road 2 days after and stopped to say so. She walked to Pigeon Creek that afternoon and sat on Ruth's porch for a while before going inside. The composition books were all there, 14 of them, the ones she had cataloged on her first visit and studied on subsequent ones. The accumulated 30-year observational record of a woman who had applied a military nurse's rigor to the study of a piece of mountain ground and had filled the results into composition books that the county would have put in a storage box and forgotten about if Maggie had allowed it. She did not allow it. She carried the books to the Harlan County Library in 2 canvas bags over 2 trips and had a conversation with the head librarian, a patient woman named Mrs. Vernon, that lasted 45 minutes and resulted in the books being cataloged as the Ruth Elkins collection and placed on open shelves in the reference section with a typed card noting their contents and their donor. Maggie's condition was the one she always attached to donated knowledge. These must be on a shelf where anyone can reach them, not in a back room where they require permission to access. Mrs. Vernon agreed without requiring the full explanation of why that condition mattered, which meant she had already understood the principle, which meant she was the right person to be in charge of the books. Daniel Marsh brought students to the Hollow for the first time in the fall of 1955, 4 of them agricultural engineering undergraduates who arrived with notebooks and the particular combination of confidence and ignorance that is specific to people who have been educated extensively in a subject they have not yet been forced to apply. Maggie spent a morning with them and answered questions and demonstrated the ventilation system and the cave temperature regulation and the composting heat transfer, and she did not simplify any of it. If they could not follow the explanation at the pace she gave it, they could ask questions and she would answer those too, but she was not going to perform her knowledge at a lower level than it operated because she was addressing people who were 30 years younger than she was. 2 of the 4 asked good questions. One of those 2 came back the following spring on his own without the group to ask about the drainage system's design, and the conversation they had that afternoon went on for 3 hours and covered more ground than any of the formal documented sessions had. She did not record the conversation, but she remembered it, which was better. By 1969, families in the hollows of eastern and southeastern Harlan County were operating earth-sheltered dairy or mixed livestock systems based in varying degrees on what Maggie had developed and taught. Each operation was different because each hollow was different. The limestone geology varied, the slope aspects varied, the water table varied. And Maggie had never taught a formula, had always taught a method of observation and adaptation, which meant the systems people built from her teaching were genuinely theirs, fitted to their specific ground, which was the only kind of system that was going to work in terrain that did not submit to standardization. The county extension office, which had initially received her letter about the water rights question with the polite caution that government offices apply to correspondence they do not know how to categorize now, sent 2 representatives to the Hollow every other year as part of a formal documentation program that was feeding into the regional agricultural policy discussions at the state level. Maggie participated in these visits with the same thoroughness she brought to everything, And she told the representatives the same thing she told Daniel Marsh's students, and the same thing she had always told anyone who came to learn the system. Works because it starts from what it actually here rather than what you wished was here. If you build for the ground the ground will work with you. If you build for the ground you wanted, you're building against everything. The Perkins brothers stayed. Garth married a woman from Everts named Doris in 1954 and built a proper house on the ridge above the hollow's east edge. And in time, two of their children worked the dairy operation alongside Clara on a wage arrangement that Clara had structured and Maggie had approved. Lewis remained unmarried by choice and lived in the original cabin on the ridge with the contentment of a man who had found the life he was built for without requiring it to look like anyone else's version. He still named things without permission, a habit that had spread from the goats to various pieces of equipment in one of the terrace sections, which he called Francis's Garden, after the aunt who had been one of the original four, Doe's namesakes, and which everyone eventually called by that name. Clara managed the business side of the dairy with the precision she had always had for numbers, and an additional quality that had developed over the years. She was good with people in the specific way that a person is good with people when they have spent time being a person to whom things were done, rather than a person who does things, because that experience, if it doesn't break you, makes you attentive to the difference in a way that nothing else quite does. She negotiated prices fairly and held to them. She kept the accounts in a ledger system she had developed herself that was more sophisticated than anything the county's cooperative agricultural network was using, and Daniel Marsh, when he saw it in 1958, asked her to present it at a regional extension meeting, which she did, and which resulted in 3 other small operations adopting the same structure. Maggie taught for 37 years after the winter she walked into the hollow. She never charged for teaching. The principle she had stated early and maintained completely, that knowledge was not hers to sell, that it passed through her and she was simply responsible for not dropping. It was not a performance of generosity. It was a reasoned position based on where her knowledge had come from, which was from books in public libraries, and from people who had given it freely, and from ground that had revealed itself to anyone who was paying attention. She had not invented the thermal properties of limestone, or the nutritional requirements of dairy goats, or the principles of composting, heat transfer. She had put them together in a specific combination in a specific place under specific pressure, and the result was worth passing on, and the passing on had to be open or it would stop. What she did charge for was the product, and she charged fairly and without apology because the product was the work of her hands and the hands of the people who worked alongside her, and those hands deserved compensation at a rate that was honest about the value of what they produced. By the time she stopped taking on new students, she was 84, and the hip that had been giving her trouble since 1971 had made the walk between the house and the cave dairy a twice-daily negotiation she was no longer willing to undertake with strangers. Watching the county extension office estimated that the direct and indirect influence of what she had taught had affected the agricultural practices of 47 farms across 4 counties. The university kept sending people. She kept receiving them. She told Clara once in the kitchen in the evening that the only thing she had ever found genuinely tiring about the teaching was not the knowledge transfer, but the repetition of the same foundational correction, which was that people kept arriving, expecting to be shown a method, and she kept having to explain that what she was showing them was a way of seeing, and those were not the same thing, and confusing them produced results that looked right on the surface and failed at the first deviation from the conditions the method was designed for. Clara looked up from the ledger she was working on. "You've been saying that for 30 years. Maggie, people have been needing to hear it for 30 years. Maggie Calloway died on a Tuesday morning in October of 1989 in the bedroom above the original root cellars where the sound that had accompanied her mornings for 37 years came up through the floorboards in the particular low register of animals that are well in waiting and occupied with their own uncomplicated requirements. She was 99 years old. Clara was with her and Garth and Doris's daughter, who had worked the dairy for 15 years and considered herself with justification part of the household, and Lewis Perkins, who was 84 himself, and who had walked down from his ridge cabin at 4 in the morning because he said he had woken up and known it was time, which was the kind of statement that would have been difficult to evaluate coming from anyone else, but that from Lewis simply seemed like the kind of information he had always been able to receive about things he paid attention to. On the bedside table, the Geological Survey book. Its cover had separated from the spine in 1967 and been reattached with bookbinding glue that Clara had sent away for specifically, and the repair had held for 22 years, though the spine had the slight, puffed quality of something that had been taken apart and put back together, which the book was not ashamed of. The back pages, the ones she had not burned that first night, the ones she had used for kindling and for drawing early plans and for whatever had needed paper. When paper was what she had, were gone, removed over the years as they were used, and in their place, she had bound in using the same bookbinder's glue. The flat pieces of slate she had written on in the early months, the ones scratched in nail point with the records of temperatures and drainage observations, and the first rough calculations for the ventilation system. They were fragile and difficult to read in low light and constituted a kind of original document that no one but Maggie had ever thought to preserve. And she had preserved them because she understood that the beginning of a thing is the part of its history that is most often lost. On the last page of the Geological Survey, in the space below the index, written in pencil in the deliberate hand of someone writing in firelight on the night of January 11th, 1952, temperature east wall warmer. Air direction outward from the hill. Draft present. Habitable. The pencil had faded to a ghost of its original line over 37 years, but the indentation remained in the paper readable by touch if the light was insufficient, which in the cave had sometimes been the only way to read anything and had been sufficient. The cheese operation passed to Lily Calloway, Clara's daughter, who had grown up in the hollow with the dairy's rhythms as the baseline of her ordinary life, which meant she had absorbed its principles without effort and its methods without drama, the way children absorb the things that are simply present and constant in the world they are given to grow up in. Lily had modern equipment and modern distribution and sent cheese to farmers markets in Lexington and Louisville. And the university still sent students, and the hollow still operated on the principles Maggie had laid down: adaptation over formula, observation over assumption, what is actually here over what you wished were here. The headstone on the ridge above the hollow in the small cemetery where the mountain fell away to the south. And on clear days you could see the ridge lines rolling to the horizon in the particular way they had always rolled, was exactly what she had asked for. Nothing about the university visits or the extension pamphlets or the 47 farms or the children who had survived a January diphtheria outbreak, because there had been milk and cheese and green vegetables underground in a mountain while the roads were impassable above. Nothing about the legal battles or the teaching or the compound interest of 37 years of work. Just the two words she had chosen because they were the most accurate description of the most important thing she had done, reduced to the plainest statement that English allowed for it. She fed people, not because she had been given the resources to feed them or been born into circumstances that made feeding people straightforward or been supported by the structures around her in the work of doing it. She had been given a canvas bag and 2 books and a pair of wool socks and the intelligence that other people had found threatening and the stubbornness that other people had found inconvenient and the particular quality of mind that looks at a hole in a cold mountain and sees in the 55-degree air moving outward through the gap, not the end of the available options, but the beginning of the next set of them. What she built was not a monument. Monuments are built for the people who build them. What she built was a system, and systems, if they are built correctly, outlast the people who conceive them, which was the only form of permanence she had ever been interested in. The limestone under the hollow would hold its temperature for as long as limestone held its temperature, which was a longer guarantee than any institution she had ever been offered membership in. The spring would run until the water table changed, and the water table changed on geological time, and she was content to leave that question to whichever of her descendants was paying attention in the relevant century. She had walked barefoot into a January that had intended to kill her, and she had come out the other side of it with a vision built from 2 books and 35 years of filed-away knowledge, and the refusal absolute and unremarkable to her, as natural as breathing, to accept that the world had to be exactly the way other people had decided it was. That refusal was not heroic in her own accounting. It was simply accurate. The world was not fixed. It was made of the same materials that everything else was made of, and materials responded to the application of sufficient knowledge and sufficient patience and sufficient willingness to be wrong about specific things on the way to being right about the larger one. She had been wrong about specific things. She recorded them in the same notebooks she used for everything else with the same absence of self-pity she applied to failed cheese batches as information as the basis for the next adjustment. She had been wrong about how long the title question would take to resolve. She had been wrong about how much capacity the original ventilation system had before it needed expansion. She had been wrong for a considerable time about the nature of the distance between herself and Clara, which she had attributed to her own failures of attention as a mother, when a more accurate attribution was that Clara had been living in a situation that required all available resources to survive, and there had been none left over for the relationship, and the blame for that belonged elsewhere. She had not been wrong about the ground. The ground which had been considered the obstacle in every conventional account of what was possible in eastern Kentucky too, steep, too rocky, too depleted, too far from the rail lines and the markets, and the institutional support that farming in easier terrain could take for granted, the ground had turned out to be the asset. The limestone karst system that ran under the mountains was a temperature regulation infrastructure of geological antiquity and zero maintenance cost. The south-facing slopes were solar collection surfaces built at precisely the angle that maximized winter sunlight. The isolated hollows that had always been described as the source of the region's poverty were, if you paid attention to what they actually contained, rather than what they failed to contain, by comparison with somewhere else, a set of conditions that could support life year-round in ways that the conventional alternatives could not. Everything that had been counted against her, the knowledge that made other people uncomfortable, the questions that made men defensive, the refusal to accept the account of what was possible from people who had decided the limits before they had finished looking, had turned out to be the equipment. The things that made her difficult were the things that built the dairy. The mind that Roy Calloway had looked at and seen a problem to be managed was the mind that kept his grandchildren alive in January 1953. She had known this in the way that people who have lived with a truth for long enough know it not with the heat of vindication which cools, but with the steady temperature of a fact that has been confirmed so many times it no longer requires confirmation. She had not needed Roy to come to the hollow in April to know it. His coming had been for him, not for her. She had understood the shape of the thing clearly enough, and on the first night in the fourth chamber, when she had sat by the fire with the photograph of Harold propped against the wall and her notebook open and the draft from the deep limestone moving cool across her face, and she had understood that the ground she was sitting on was not the end of her options. It was the beginning of them. It was if she was willing to pay attention to what was actually there rather than mourn what had been taken, everything she needed. She had been right about that. She had been right about that from the first night. And she had built accordingly, and the building had lasted, and the lasting was sufficient.